Hello, my friends. Mary Rose Wood here. I'm happy that it's Wednesday because Wednesdays when I go live on YouTube and Facebook to talk about writing craft with you. So welcome back, storytellers. If you happen to be watching on Facebook, you are cordially invited to go to StreamYard.com/Facebook and just click. It's just a one little click that you have to do, and that will give Facebook permission to show your name when you leave a comment, which I hope you do. These live streams are wonderful when they include your questions, your thoughts, your comments, your own observations about your writing practice. And so I love to hear it. I love to hear it. So I'm going to open up my comment. Hey there. All right. Hey, Rosalind. It's great to see you here. And Wheezy. Wonderful. Wonderful to see two of my storyteller buddies and students participating live. I'm so glad. So you guys probably know, and for the rest of you out there, I don't expect you all to know, but I recently had a birthday. Now, the passage of time is a great clarifier, don't you think? You know, it's such a cliche, and you tell it to young people and they're like, yeah, really? But it's true. The older you get, the faster time goes. The more you realize that, you know, you have fewer years in front of you than perhaps you have behind you. And it is a tremendous source of clarity, right? When we only have a little bit of time to spend, we are mindful about how we spend it. You know, it's you don't have to get all, you know, into mortality. We don't have to have a mortality talk to know what this is like. If you've ever been on a vacation that you wished would never end, and you wake up on the last day of the vacation and you think, okay, this is it. This is our last day in paradise. This is our last day in this special place. What are we going to do? Like, let's do something amazing. All of a sudden, time becomes precious. Scarcity makes things precious. And when time is scarce, it is precious. So what does this have to do with writing? What does it have to do with writing? Well, interestingly, when you create a narrative, I mean, that's almost the definition, or part of the definition, of what constitutes a narrative, isn't it? It's something that it's a tale of transformation, of change, that of necessity, unless you're writing some extremely experimental, you know, stream of consciousness narrative, or maybe something way out in a sci-fi universe where time doesn't exist. Almost of necessity, like, change takes time, right? Your narrative is going to have a timeline. It's a story that's going to take place over the course of a day, a week, a season, a year, a decade. You know, think of the stories that you know. Think of the stories that you're working on. There's a clock, right? And that clock starts and stops. It starts at the beginning, it stops at the end. And in between those two markers, a certain quantity of time has passed in the life of your hero, right? It may be a tiny bit, it may be a lot. That's up to you. I mean, you can write a full-length novel that takes place in an hour if you really try. I'm not saying it'd be easy to do, but you could choose to do that. Or you could write a saga. I'm actually very close to needing to sneeze. I'm going to build suspense now. You're all going to be waiting to see if I conquer the need to sneeze. I think I did. You can write a narrative, right, that takes place in this little bit of time, or you can choose to tell a whole life story. You can do a cradle to grave saga, the life of somebody, right? You can write a story that spans generations. I mean, that is an incredible amount of power that we have as storytellers, isn't it? You know, we really have this capacity to, you know, finish one chapter, turn the page, saying 10 years later, you know, and then we've zoomed forward. So we have this incredible capacity to manage the passage of time, both to speed it up or to slow it down. In life, not so. In life, not so. Although it's been said that when we are deeply engaged with the things that we love, that we do manage to slow down time, and that we have this kind of, you know, perspective of just being in a forever moment. And I think many creative people can relate to that. The flow state, some people call it. And if there's any magic trick to expanding the amount of time you have allotted to you, that probably is it. Find the thing you love and spend as much time as you can in that state. But we have to make decisions as writers, don't we? As storytellers, we have to figure out what, not only how long this journey of transformation is going to take, but at the exact moment it begins. Now, many writers struggle to know when the right moment on the clock of the narrative has come to begin telling the story. And one of the things that one sees when there is a little bit of confusion about this is chapters that begin, in the morning of an ordinary day in the life of Jane Hero, and we get to know her, and it goes on a bit, and we get to know her people, and we get to know her life, we get to know her job, and it's interesting, but then we really a couple of chapters of that go on, and then finally, something happens. And what those writers have been doing is they've been exploring. They've been writing exploratory material, which is great. Everything that we do to get to know the world of our story and the inner and outer landscape of our hero better is productive work, highly productive work. But then when we go back to really shape our narrative, what happens to that exploratory writing? It's like you just chop it off and you slide everything to the left. You don't start your telling there. There's a shift of mindset that must happen between the drafting and the editing phases of your project. The drafting is about you and your creative process, your capacity to invent, your desire to get to know the world of your narrative and sort of figure out what you're doing there, And the editing process is all about the reader. It's about what the reader's experience is going to be. It's quite a big shift in mindset. These are not, they're two related tasks, but they're very different. And so once we make that shift to say, okay, now I have to make all of this work for the reader, you are going to start your story, as is often said, as late as possible. You are going to slice off as much of that exploratory throat clearing, all of those scenes of exploration, right? You're going to get rid of them. You're going to slide the whole thing over to the left, and you are going to start on the day that the story begins. You might start the moment you want the clock to begin. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. You know what my go-to examples are by now. The Hobbit starts the day Gandalf shows up to visit his old friend Bilbo. It doesn't start a week before. We don't actually need a chapter to get to know Middle-earth, what hobbits are like, the world of the Shire. I mean, imagine how much one could write about all of that. This is a world that the reader had never seen before. This was a brand new fictional universe that Tolkien had invented. One could forgive him if he wanted to spend a little time getting us oriented in it before dropping the first big, and one day something happened that never happened before. And it was this: Gandalf came to the door and said, Bilbo, I've been thinking about you. I want to send you on an adventure. Tolkien is too smart for that. We know, if we read his biographies, how much time he spent inventing languages and thinking about cultures and studying mythology and all that stuff. He was a wonderful scholar and researcher and explorer of invented worlds. But when the time came to tell a story, he just started when the story started. He didn't start with all of that other stuff. He started on the day. Similarly, one of my favorite first lines in literature is, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" Fans of children's lit and books about farms will recognize that at once as being the first line of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Now, there's nobody who, wrote better about the beauty of nature and the complexity of animals and the merits of life on a farm than E.B. White. But did he spend a chapter introducing us to Fern and her family and what their normal lives were like? He did not. The first line of the book is, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" It is the thing that's never happened before that sets the clock. It just kind of starts the clock of the tale. So when we talk about time in fiction, that's one of the first things that I invite you to consider is, where does the clock start ticking, right? There's this like ongoing, and life was going on for however many decades for Bilbo. Fern is 8 years old when we meet her. There's years of content. There's all kinds of stuff that's been that by implication we know has happened in the past. But the story is a work of art. The artist, the writer, has chosen a frame, and we're going to get that story, what happens in that frame. We're not going to spend lots of time outside of the frame. This is a very crafted piece of creation, of intentional creation. The intentional part happens a lot in the editing, because in the drafting there's a lot of exploration, and so we leave our intentions loose. Our intention is to discover, and when we're drafting, and if we've got good story structure craft, our explorations are guided. They're not open-ended, they're guided. We're looking for story. We're not looking for everything. We're particularly on the scent of what the story is. But then when we get into the editing, we've really got to be very strict about things like where to begin. So that is where your story must start. And we've got a question from Rosalind already. Fantastic, Rosalind. Does that mean to always start, as is said, in the middle of things, in medias res, as in the Latin? I would say in general, that is what that piece of advice means, Rosalind. But the middle of things is not a generic prescription either. In the middle of what? In the middle of what? In the opening of Anna Karenina, which I highly recommend as a terrific example of an omniscient third-person point of view, opens in the middle of a family in crisis. It's one paragraph that just describes, they've just found out recently that the father is having an affair with with one of the household staff, and everyone is in an uproar. The mother's upset, the children's upset, the staff is upset, the people are quitting. It's in one paragraph. It's literally dropped in the middle of a household in crisis. It's quite wonderfully comic, actually. It's farcical. There's so much going on, and the reader is dropped in the middle of it, and then a narrative spins out of that. So that's an example. The example that people use in the middle of things is often specifically meant to imply to drop the reader into the middle of a scene that is ongoing. That is not necessary. You can take a moment, I think, to establish a little something, right? Just a tiny bit of world. If you look at the beginning of the first book in the Incorrigible Children series, you will find that I drop the reader into the middle of a scene in progress. The main character, Penelope, is on a train ride, but not just any train ride. It is the train ride that takes her from the only home she's ever known to her very first job interview, right? So it's very much in the middle of things. But from that moment of the middle, we get to find out a little bit what happened in the past, how she came to have to go, and what her anticipations and fears are for the next. So we're sort of in the middle of a scene. The opening of The Hobbit, and granted, this is an older book, and narrative styles do change. What readers have the patience for probably shifts over time as well. If you open in the middle of The Hobbit, what you do get is about a page and a quarter of a setting that is powerfully inflected with character. And through the description that the book opens with of Bilbo Baggins' home, the door that is a circle, like a porthole, the shining brass knob in the exact middle, the litany of neatness, orderliness, tidiness, prosperity, of all of that, hospitality, the pride that he takes in his home, the fondness that he has for visitors. that is actually a passage of description, but is it just description? Oh, obviously not. What Tolkien is doing so brilliantly there is he's using one page to draw a literal map of Bilbo's psyche, of his inner landscape, of who he is when the story begins, which of necessity, by the time we've read that page, we readers are, we're smart. We're like, oh, he likes things to be orderly. Oh, he likes to stay home. Oh, he's a hobbit and they're very conservative and they'd like to be respectable. We already know, because we are human beings and we are wired for story, that, well, if that's where we are now, clearly all of that is going to get tipped over. All of that is going to get knocked down. Everything that is about to happen to this poor little fellow is going to be the opposite of what his comfort zone currently is. And so the story has begun on a psychological level, disguised as description. So that's masterful storytelling. So Rosalind, I would say that that's an example of not starting in the middle of a scene and not dropping into the middle of, we're having breakfast and Papa walks through the kitchen with an axe. That's a scene in motion already, and we're just dropped in the middle of it. Tolkien does something a little different, but do not mistake it for clearing throat. He's not going, I'm vamping until Gandalf comes, which is, just on the very next page. He's just telling you exactly what you need to know to start to say, oh my goodness, something has got to be about to happen. And he doesn't make us wait more than a page. We get there instantly. Something's going to mess this up. And this character, this is the fellow that we're going to watch go on this huge journey of transformation. So that is a nuanced answer, right? The quick answer is yes, of course, we start in the middle of things. We got to be in the middle of something, but the middle of what? Most of the time, people will say that meaning to start in the middle of the scene, but that's not necessarily so. You can start with a little something else before you drop into scene, if that little something else is essential and important and, kind of sets the table in a way that is not going to try the patience of the reader. You must let the reader know instantly that everything I'm telling you is essential. Yes, Paul's got a great response to that. Let me share it for those of you who might not be able to see the YouTube comments. Yes, it does drop you in the middle of the scene. It is a scene that consists of the first 50 years of Bilbo's life. And so, Paul, the word that we use for that kind of scene is actually not scene, it's summary. It's dropping us in the middle of a summary of the first 50 years of Bilbo's life. And that summary is kind of conveyed through the artful use of details that are inflected with character. Whose character? The hero's character. So that litany of details is not a scene, the way I use the word scene. A scene is actually like action taking place, almost like in a screenplay. Like, some things are happening, people are talking, we're in a place. The clock of time is ticking. The clock of time is not ticking in summary. There's no clock of story time rolling. The director, Tolkien, has not said action. He doesn't say go until Gandalf arrives and then they have an encounter that clearly, if you clocked it, it would be, a 5-minute conversation. That's real time in the narrative. Talking about the details of the way Bilbo lives there's no clock ticking. That's sort of between us and the narrator. That's like in the realm of consciousness. Now, I know you were here, and I hope those of you who were not here will go back and watch the previous live stream about point of view, which I think unraveled and demystified in a pretty comprehensive way how point of view sort of functions as a kind of a consciousness of the book, and that then drops into scene and then pulls out again and drops back in. This is the beauty of fiction. This is the magic trick of fiction. So, and Rosalind adds wonderfully well read, the beginning of David Copperfield that begins his story of his life with the beginning of his life. Of course. Now, see, there's a choice. You can write a David Copperfield type novel that is like, this is the story of a person from the beginning to end. I think of It's a Wonderful Life, right? The great Frank Capra movie that probably some of us got to rewatch this past Christmas. So it's still a bit fresh in my mind because I did rewatch it. And the frame of that story is a great example of how the narrative takes us from the birth of our hero, George Bailey, to the present day. Very quickly, it summarizes him. Why? Because the viewer, right, needs to know this information. And so the clever screenwriter has created a kind of a narrative framework to give us that information, right? There's an angel who's got a mission to intervene as a mentor at this crisis moment in George's life. But in order for us to appreciate it, we have to see what's happened before. So we get the whole story because angels have the power to summarize things very, very quickly. So it can be very powerful to tell the whole story, you know. But then we focus on the big turning point. Then the narrator focuses on the big turning point. Great question from Wheezy. Let me get Wheezy's question up here. Does the age of the reader influence how quickly you should get to the action in the first few sentences? Well, many might argue that, Wheezy. Some might argue that today's younger readers do not have the patience to wait even that page that Tolkien asked them to wait to get to Gandalf's arrival. Some might argue that, you know, our attention spans have shrunk to the point that even one page of learning all about, you know, our hero's inner landscape is too much to expect of today's reader before they get, you know, to the juicy stuff. You are not going to hear that from me. That's what I can tell you. It is a very insightful question. And for those of you who might, you know, really be out there pitching your work to today's, you know, in today's agents, editors, conferences, you will hear people in the industry talk about this, that they are, you know, that they are convinced that for younger readers that attention span is such a commodity that we have to write at a pace. You know, we have to write at the pace of TikTok. We have to write at the pace of something that is, you know, akin to the types of media that provide this instant gratification, the dopamine rush, every sentence of something breathless happening. You're never going to hear that from me. So I don't believe it. And I think that people who read, you know, this is a soapbox we could certainly get on for a whole hour, right? I think that when we sit down to read, and people who really love reading, one of the things they love about it is that it is not one car chase after another. It's not operating at that external, superficial pace of action, and nothing but action. Are books that have that kind of content very popular? Sure, you can read all kinds of, at any age group. There are plenty of adults that will only read thrillers, if that's what they like. There's a book for every reader, you know, and there's hopefully a reader for most good books. It depends so much, you know, on what your particular narrative is trying to accomplish. But I feel that even a story, it's not an either or, that even a story that is grounded very much in a high stakes, full of action plot, and who could argue that The Hobbit is not that? Of course it's that. That it is made a deeper and richer work of literature by not forgetting to include the inner life. And the thing that one must bear in mind is that if you have good writing craft, the book does not become twice as long just because you include the inner life. It's just that you are so adept at including it seamlessly and invisibly, not by saying, oh, now I'm going to have a page of nothing happening. We never have a page of nothing happening. It's one of my mottos: always be telling story, always. If you are always telling story, the reader is in that flow state in which there is no time. So a 400-page book can fly by if it is written at a certain level of craft, because every sentence is moving the story forward. Every sentence is either giving us, what happens next in the hero's journey of transformation, or, on the outside, or it's giving it to us on the inside. It's connecting all the dots. It's just, it is a unbroken line of dominoes that, once it begins, the reader is on board for the whole ride. So, so those types of questions about the marketplace, we have to be, we have to balance them with our own ambition. But a writer who's not as adept, say, as Tolkien at establishing deep character by the use of detail is going to write a page of detail that doesn't do anything. It's going to just be a list, like a shopping list. And an astute editor is going to say, cut all of that. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't move the story forward, right? The editor is right to say it doesn't work, but that editor might not then be saying, but here's how to make it work. There is a way in which this could be essential. An editor who looked at Tolkien's first page about Bilbo's house and said, oh, cut this. Let's just start when Gandalf comes. That editor, is not good at their job. But nobody said that, right? That's not how it happened. I'm just saying the kind of feedback that one might get is like, oh, no, let's just skip all this. They either are not seeing the purpose of it, or the writer has not yet made it work. So all of that is true. Rosalind, let's wrap this wonderful conversation with a comment from Rosalind, who I know has great knowledge of child readers, and they do like to be immersed in the world of the book, but they don't want it. They don't want it to be rushed through it. They don't, actually. I, having written a fairly lengthy 6-book series, right, as I have done with the Incorrigible Children books, I never get a piece of mail from a reader saying, "Oh, I got to the end and I wish that it had taken half the time." They always want book 7. Like they just always want the next. But what happens then? Once you've managed to lure a reader into your fictional creation through the use of good storytelling and good writing craft, so that they are experiencing it not as something they're reading in a book, but as something that happens to them. And they are experiencing those characters not as words on a page, but living, breathing characters that rise off the page. You can check out the conversation we had in a previous live stream about characters who come to life. Those readers just want to stay in that world. It's an incredible trip for them. It's an incredible experience for them. So they don't want to be rushed out of it. So all of these questions about pace and, how much action we got to put on the page to engage the reader. Action is not the way to engage a reader. Story is the way to engage a reader. So let me pivot from that statement to a couple more points I wanted to make with you all today about the use of time in fiction. So we've really now been talking about how to know when to start the clock of your story, right? So we've made that point. And of course, you end it when the journey of transformation has complete. Your hero's been through a comprehensive, well-earned journey of change, the mission that they set out to accomplish near the beginning of the story has been concluded. I'm not going to say accomplished, because they may have gotten to that mission at the end of the second act and discovered, as Bilbo does, that is actually not the end of what happens, that the scene that has been promised to the reader has taken place for sure, but the consequences of that scene are surprising and add fresh new challenges and propel our hero into the third act, where now a whole new set of problems with higher stakes and deeper meaning have to be addressed. And this is where we really see if our hero has, completed this journey of change. Have they done it or not? If we've done our jobs, our protagonist is no longer the same character by the time they get to that third act set of challenges. So when that's all resolved and something, in some way, positively, negatively, or ambivalently, then it's time, to let the story end. It doesn't mean we have to wrap up every single eventuality, but the stuff, the narrative, journey of transformation that we chose to put in the frame of this particular work of art is reached its end. And so we have to have the discipline to stop, even though it's sometimes very hard to stop. So that's the big timeline. And it can be very practical when you're drafting a book or tweaking your outline to say, okay, but wait a minute, how many days have passed? Make a calendar, work on like this happens and then this happens and this happens and this happens. That didn't all happen in a week. Maybe that happened over the course of a school year, as in one of the Harry Potter novels. Or maybe it happened over the course of a growing season from spring to fall, as in Charlotte's Web, also my recent novel, Alice's Farm, which, starts in the spring and ends in the harvest with a little bit of after, what happens after, kind of a coda of what happens after the harvest is complete. So there's time within the tale as well. And that time can be dictated by a number of things. So consider how time works within your narrative, not just at the start and the finish, but internally. Is there some natural clock ticking? For example, the natural sequence of seasons on a farm. You set a story on a farm, you have to know what time of year it is. It can't just be generic, because what a farm is like in the spring, the summer, and the fall is 3 completely different worlds, right? So maybe there are qualities of the natural rhythms of time that impact your story. And don't use them as set dressing. Weave them in, weave them into the narrative, because that is part of the world you've chosen. Chances are it has some meaning. Maybe there's an external deadline, like, the end of the school year, the school play, those of you who are writing kids books, how many times is like the spelling bee or the prom or some event that's on the calendar inside the fictional world actually turns out to be a deadline of sorts, right? That the story is building to that. Those kinds of deadlines become an intrinsic part of how you structure your narrative, because you're always aiming for the deadline. Now, in fiction, as in life, a deadline adds urgency. And so, from our previous discussions and from your own good work, that we have to escalate the trouble, the difficulties that our hero is going through all through the second act. There's obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, but they're not all the same. They challenge different parts of the hero because they're provoking change, right? They're provoking growth. They're not just provoking one kind of growth. They're provoking this holistic transformation of consciousness, to quote Joseph Campbell. So the types of obstacles will change, and the types of resources, resilience, strength, courage, sacrifice, all that inner stuff that your hero is going to have to summon to meet each new challenge will change too. So they'll get a well-rounded workout. But the difficulty, the intensity, the urgency also escalates. So there's a sense of escalation. Nothing escalates urgency like a deadline. And that's true for writers, for sure. Anyone who's ever had to write to a deadline, you know what I'm talking about. You can procrastinate for a while, but when that deadline is looming, you become capable of heroic feats of writing and revising if the deadline is looming. So I want you to think about in your projects, I want you to think about where those deadlines fall, the natural deadlines, forces of nature, seasons, timelines, the events that you create in your story that have a locked place on the calendar, the end of the school year, the prom, the last ship to leave Earth, like anything you invent in whatever genre, the closing argument of the trial, you think about all of these things, like they are on the calendar. They don't just happen whenever. So if you build the world of your story with the specificity of these events happening, it's great, because then you apply more pressure to the hero. Change requires pressure. It does not happen in comfort. It only happens under pressure. So use time to level up the pressure on your hero. A device that I, again, used in the Incorrigible Children series is that, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who maybe has not read all the way to the end, but one character in one of the later books in the series actually becomes pregnant. Talk about a ticking clock, right? Once this character is pregnant, a whole set of events then have to be timed because things have to be accomplished before the birth of the baby. It's a great deadline. It's a wonderful deadline, and I make a lot of narrative hay out of it, right? It just makes things urgent. One more that I would add in terms of a narrative time is the nature of a coming of age tale. You know, it sometimes includes this quality of time is up because childhood is over. There's two that I think of sometimes. They both happen to be by Rudyard Kipling. One is a short story, one is a novel. And the short story is Rikki Tikki Tavi. And anyone who's studied with me knows that I like to use that as an example of really story structure done at a very compressed scale, because it is a full hero's journey in 7,000 words. It's a classic short story. But the character of Rikki is a mongoose, and when we meet him, he's young. He's a young mongoose, and the thing that happens to get the clock started on Rikki's story is that there's a flood that washes him out of his burrow where he lives with his parents. So he's really quite a baby. You know, he's a very young mongoose. And you can say, well, a flood is not, you know, what does that have to do with the hero's journey? That's so random. But it's not random, right? Because this is a work of art. This is a construction. Rikki is a baby, and his destiny is to grow up. That is everybody's destiny, right? If we're lucky. And we don't get to stay babies forever. We have to leave home. We have to find our potency. We have to take our place in the world. And in the fictional universe of this particular story, a mongoose's job is to grow up and defend against cobras. And the cobra and the mongoose are mortal enemies. And that is what a mongoose is born to do. So baby mongooses do not do this. They stay in their burrows, and their parents go out and hunt and bring them cobra meat to eat. But the time comes that we have to grow up and hunt our own cobras, right? We have to get our own cobra meat, and we have to become the king of our own gardens. So there's lots of philosophy, always lots of deep imagery when you start to think about these narratives, these hero's journey narratives. So this flood is not a flood the way you could say, oh, it was just a random disaster. This was the flood of destiny that came and plucked the baby out of the burrow, threw him alone into a garden where, guess what? He was the only mongoose. If there was a job to do that only a mongoose could do, there was no one else to do it but Rikki. And guess what he discovers right away after a couple of interesting little scenes where he deals with the initial obstacles of this house that he lands in that is inhabited by people, which is news to him. And he's never seen humans before. But he almost instantly discovers that guess who's living in this particular garden? Oh, cobras. There you go. And so this is it. And so then we read the story of how Rikki goes from having never seen a cobra before, but knowing what his destiny is, to having to be the guy. Like, he's the only mongoose in this garden. If someone's going to deal with these cobras, it has to be him. And we watch him grow up in 7,000 words. And by the end of that story, he's transformed. He's now confident. He's done his job, and he's new sheriff in town, right? It's a classic story. He's there, and he's going to protect this garden and its inhabitants from cobras forevermore. So you see that the passage of time has this other quality as well, that it can nudge a story along because time nudges us along. Stories are based in emotional and psychological truth. And I began this live stream talking about my birthday and the clarity that comes when you become very attuned to the passage of time. You start saying, well, what do I really have how much time do I have left? How many more books am I going to have time to write? How much more teaching am I going to get to do? I hope a few more decades, right? But that's even saying that is a very different perspective from being a young person at the beginning of your life saying, well, here we go. It's going to be a wild ride. We don't have that sense of like, I actually kind of know what my job is. How much time am I going to have left to do it? How much more of it am I going to get to do? What's wasting my time? What can I get rid of that's just not essential right now? Because I want to focus on what I know are my big tasks. So time has that quality as well, the emotionally true part of it. Let me just, thank you for the happy birthday wishes. Let me just double check in the comments again. I have one more thing I want to tell you about what you can do as a writer to deploy time as a really powerful tool in your story structure. I am going to, I am not familiar. I'm going to put your comment up, Paul, just in case anyone else wants to know about Brandon Sanderson. I don't know his lectures. And as he talks about the danger of revising sideways instead of improving through revision. I am going to guess, since I'm not familiar with his lectures, Paul, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that the difference between revising sideways and improving through revision is when you revise sideways, you're just making things different. But maybe you don't have enough of clarity of intention to know why you're making the changes you're making. You're just changing them because you have new impulses now. I have news for you. Every time you sit down to work, you're a creative person. Everyone watching this is a creative person. You wouldn't be watching this if you weren't really interested in writing and actively, in pursuit of that practice at whatever level and at whatever pace. When you're a creative person, you will have impulses. So when you sit down to read something you wrote 2 weeks ago, you will have new ideas. Is that a signal to revise? It depends. What's wrong with what you wrote? How can it be made better? And not just how can it be made better in a wild, generic, open-ended way, but how can it be made better for this story? It is just one puzzle piece of the longer narrative you're writing. This is the part that is tricky when you're writing a novel length piece. Not even a long novel. It can be a short novel, a 40 or 50,000 word novel, like a suitable, for the young readers length novel. You can't do it all in a gulp, right? You can't get it all out in a single burst of work at white heat. It's too much. You can't do it. And so you need some kind of craft and self-awareness so that you can build a lot of different puzzle pieces that are all going to fit together at the end. So I'm guessing, Paul, that this notion of revising sideways is what happens when you tinker with your puzzle pieces, but you haven't really gotten that like bird's eye view of what the big purpose of these revisions might be. There's a lot to say about this. When I teach my Path of the Storyteller students, we do it in lesson by lesson, like bite-sized pieces, always with the understanding that these are the individual dance steps. But then at the end, one is going to have to be quite focused on how they all come together in the choreography. And luckily for we writers, we're not like dancers who, talk about a deadline. The show must go on. Right? How many times have we heard that? 8 p.m. comes, the curtain goes up, lights on, the audience is there, they've paid good money for tickets. You have to deliver the goods. That is just the very essence of a time-driven deadline. And so that dancer may have rehearsed for months to put all the steps together, and now is their time to just do the dance all at once. We writers never have to do that. Isn't that remarkable? We get to just revise at different levels throughout. We can revise the language, we can revise the dialogue, we can focus on the description, we can work on story structure, we can work on compression, right? We can say, I'm going to go through and just make sure that this is as tight as a drum, that I have, in the words of, E.B. White, omitted needless words. We've got all of these different little dance steps to do, but we can do them in different revisions. But we have to coordinate our efforts so that we are not revising sideways. We're not just making it different because we have new impulses. We will always have new impulses. They have to be harnessed into the service of the big picture of that book, of our vision for that particular book. You've got more books to write, and your impulses are going to have room to play, but not everything you know has to be in this particular narrative. So let me just, before we get to talking about time, the passage of time, we've talked about setting the clock started at the beginning of your tale. We've talked about the role that sort of natural deadlines might play within the structure of the narrative to keep that urgency building, right? Oh, Rosalind's got a comment just on that. Let me just get that, Rosalind, before I move on. Fred, is it important to have obstacles or challenges that must be met in time to prevent disaster? Well, they are so useful, Rosalind. That's exactly the point, right, that I'm making today, and that I want you to consider, is that your hero is going to have obstacles and challenges all the way through the narrative. That's what the book is made of. It's the hero in pursuit of a mission, confronting obstacle and challenge. So part of your job is your capacity to keep inventing the right challenges that make your hero grow in the right ways in order to be who they need to be at the end of the book. And one of the many tools at your disposal is time. That is a great tool for upping the ante, for raising the stakes, for adding urgency, for re-engaging the reader, right? Because they also will be like, oh, they're going to react to it like, oh my goodness, he's only got 24 hours to rescue the girl before the kidnappers, do the thing, right? Think about all of the ways that time functions. And that is this last example that I use, we'll call it the Liam Neeson example, right? How many Liam Neeson movies have been like, not only does he have to do something, and he has to do something really high stake, life and death, but there's a deadline. The villain has said, you've got 48 hours to do this, that, and the other thing. That's sort of the last type of urgency that you can add in. So it's not necessarily hooked into the natural world. It's not hooked into the emotional truth of what the passage of time forces us to do, whether it's grow up or confront mortality. Talk about King Lear for a second, how the passage of time is a character, right? In King Lear, this is an old king. Time has caught up with him, just as time catches up with baby Ricky and throws him into the garden where he's got to learn to fight to be the mongoose who can fight the cobras. King Lear is a king. Was he a good king, a bad king? It doesn't matter. He's an old king. What matters about King Lear is that he has reached the point that he is now old enough that he has been asked to hand over the reins of power. And guess when that story begins? The ceremony in which he's handing over the reins of power. And then he spends the rest of that tale grappling with what time insists. Time insists that he bow down gracefully, which, is really hard for him because he's got a big ego. So so time is at the beginning of life, time at the end of life, time in the middle of life. All of these things can create urgency. But as storytellers, we can create those Liam Neeson kind of moments as well. We can just invent them apart from these natural rhythms. We can just say, nope, and that's when that is got to happen. That deadline is imposed by some reality that we create. There's only so much time left. And I have to tell you, I'm a Star Trek fan, but I haven't had time to catch up with all the new Star Trek shows, right? All the abundance of new Star Trek shows. But I finally just did watch the first season of Picard. And as a storyteller, as someone who thinks all the time about story structure, I can't help but sit and watch any kind of narrative and say, oh, there's that. Look what they're doing. It's like, being a chef who goes to eat at your competitor's restaurant. Like, you're like, okay, they used some saffron there. Nice. Oh, I would have put less salt. Like, you have this kind of professional, eye that you kind of look and say, I could steal that, or, well done, or, oh, you missed it, right? You have this kind of professional critique about it. And you better believe that the whole culmination of the whole series was this, this cavalcade, like a layer cake of all these storytelling energies. One of them included a very, a kind of bluntly inserted deadline. Like, okay, they've activated the such and such machine and it's throwing a beam of whatever into the sky, and who knows what is going to come through the portal that it opens, and it's all happening on this ticking clock. And so then you've got three different, narratives. Like there's the battle here between the actual starships, and then there's the psychological battle as Picard tries to convince somebody to do something, and it's all going on simultaneously, and the scenes are cutting back and forth. But what's driving the whole thing is that there's only a matter of seconds, maybe a minute, before whatever is going to burst through this portal and destroy all life everywhere. Talk about high stakes. It's not even life or death. It's like existence and annihilation. This is what epic stories play in. This is how big, like, they turn the dial of storytelling all the way up to almost a comic extreme. But there it was. I'm tempted as a punster to say the timeless power of this kind of narrative deadline. Like it is literally like a bomb, the bomb has been set. It's going to go off in 60 seconds. What can we do? So how do we get out of this with literal clock ticking? So those are sort of different levels of playing with time in your narrative. It is a useful tool. It is just a really useful tool when we ponder all the ways that we can invent urgency, we can invent new challenges for our character, we can complicate their situation, we can make things urgent. We can do it literally by making them urgent in the most literal sense. We can put a clock on it. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys. So let me just devote myself now to your questions, whatever is left in mind about the use of time. And I want you all, do a little self-reflection. I know you're all writing stuff. Have you incorporated time as a dimension of the storytelling? That's my challenge for you. Think about it. You can offer me a comment now, something in the chat box now, or leave a comment below the video, and let me know if you've done that already, or if maybe this conversation is giving you some ideas about how you might use time as a really effective storytelling tool to add tension, urgency, and obstacles to your hero's journey of change. I see one more comment. Let me share from Paul. And this is in reference to what we talked about a few minutes ago. That is this notion of a sideways revision, right? Versus revision to improve. A stagnant story is one that moves sideways, not forward. Well, I certainly will agree with that. But as sideways is not a move in storytelling. I use my own terminology, and I'm going to come out and say that sideways is not a move, right? Sideways is just something you need to cut. One could imagine a story that has multiple plots, like a main plot and some subplots, right, that come together. And in a situation like that, you might say that when you cut from you switch, right? In a movie, you would cut, but we do the same thing in fiction because they stole it from us. Bless them. Storytelling started out long before movies. That when we switch from one narrative thread to another, that feels sideways, but it shouldn't. That is one of the things that can get something very bogged down, is if the reader keeps experiencing that we make a little forward progress in one narrative thread, and then we're thrown into another narrative thread and we have to go back and sort of catch up, but then we keep switching. It's like a hopscotch type structure. That does try the reader. It's not terribly useful. Way to think of it. If you have multiple plot threads, you have to move forward and then you switch, but keep moving forward. And that only works, of course, if you've done the very honest soul searching that every writer must do when they are tempted to include multiple plot threads, and so many writers are, whether these multiple plot threads are necessary or whether you have not yet fully immersed yourself in that single line of story of your hero on a journey of transformation. whether you are not trusting that that is enough, whether you have not dug deep enough into that to fully commit to writing it. And so instead of really writing it, you just you keep sort of hopping out of it and doing, to use an image I've used before, that you keep digging these little shallow wells. So you end up with a whole field of like these, shallow holes, which you're never going to get down to where the water table is. That's not what we do. Like when you are telling a story, you're telling the full truth of a very profound journey of change in one consciousness. And in complicated big novels, there may be multiple plot threads, but they all are thematically somehow doing the same work. That's why they're together. If they were, if they don't randomly, the writer doesn't say, I've got 3 ideas for books. I don't know which one to write first. I know. I'll just weave them all together. It'll be a triple strand necklace. That's not the reason to weave stories together, is because you've got multiple ideas. Those maybe are 3 different books. You have one story, and if there are subplots that deepen it, the way, for example, you could look at The Hobbit and say that Bilbo's story of change over the course of the book, the counterbalance to that is Thorin's story of refusing to change. And then there's a wonderful climactic scene at near the very end where those 2 stories, really collide, and they end up from friends to terrible adversaries, and then resolved in a beautiful deathbed scene, because Thorin pays the only price possible for his refusal to change. He goes down the way King Lear goes down, but Bilbo is there, and they can sort of exchange mutual blessings. It's a very powerful and beautiful scene. So subplots are in service to the main plot. So sideways is just not the right way. The very nature of story is that there is a hero on a mission, and the way to that mission is narrow. It's like crossing a balance beam, and story structure is so much about what is the next thing that your hero must do to get to that mission while staying on the balance beam. They don't get to jump off. I used to live in New York, and I love the New York City Marathon, and every year I would watch it. I used to live in a neighborhood where they would run right by, and I would go watch it in person. And then after I moved, I'd watch it on TV. And every year there was that story of the person who bothered to register for the marathon and show up and get the bib, and they're wearing the clothes, and the race would start, and they'd jump on the train and they'd take that shortcut to the finish line. Just like, what's the satisfaction in that? We can't let our heroes do that ever. We can't let them go sideways. We can't let them off the balance beam. There's a certain amount of pressure that comes from them being on a mission to a destination, and that everything they do has got to bring them closer to it. Even if they try to do things to bring them closer and those things backfire and turn into setbacks, then that was a great obstacle, and then they have to do the next thing to fix it. They've got to stay on track. They've got to renew their commitment to achieving their mission when that happens. So, guys, great question from Rosalind, and I think this will be our last question that we take today. So Rosalind says, can the use of time include hints of what might happen as well as flashbacks? So these are 2 great concepts: foreshadowing, right, and flashback. Hints of what might happen. Foreshadowing is a kind of it's a great little literary tool. It helps build suspense. It is used, judiciously, right? You don't want to tease the reader by withholding information. We did a talk about that as well. The one about unwrapping presents. That's a great one to go back and look at when you think about foreshadowing, but in a kind of in a poetic sense. You can foreshadow with language where the story is going, what the themes are going to reveal themselves to be at the deepest level. It's a kind of a way of letting there be a little ironic space between what the narrator knows about the story and what the when I say narrator, I mean the narrating consciousness, kind of like the super consciousness of the book itself, which exists even when you're writing in the first person. That sense of that this was a work of art that's in somebody's hands. It's been designed for the reader to have this great experience. It knows where it's going, so that you can have like even foreshadowing that exists in the first sentence. It's one of the marks of a kind of a really strong opening of a book, is this quality that the first line gives us a little snow globe of this tiny little version of what's to come. Where's Papa going with that axe? What is this book about? It's about death. It's always about death. There isn't a page of an end back to time and mortality, and thus it is about life. It is about how the death is what makes life so precious. If we had unlimited time, we would waste it probably, right? So that is the knowledge of that, the foreshadowing of that is in the first line there. That to me is a kind of a wonderful use of foreshadowing. Flashbacks, of course, are another thing. Now, a thing about a flashback is that it is a scene. And so I think flashbacks can be great when used with tremendous discipline, but we don't just use flashbacks to dump in information or backstory, right? The flashback is a scene, and therefore something important needs to happen in it. And what does that mean? That whatever happens in the flashback has got to be relevant to that timeline, the present day timeline of the story. So Rosalind, I love this question, because what you're raising, is the fact that there can be multiple timelines at play within a story, right? Unless there's a character in the narrative who's psychic, like, for example, the Rabbit Fiver in Watership Down, another wonderful novel. Unless you have a character who has premonitions of what's to come, literally as part of the plot, then whenever you talk about hints of what might happen or foreshadowing, you're really talking about the author creating a kind of a consciousness that the book exists in, that is sort of leading the reader into thematic territory. Who else would know the future? If nobody in the book knows the future, where do those hints of what might to come emanate from? So that's a really interesting metaphysical question. Flashbacks are useful when they illuminate important things that have to do with the present day. And a great use of flashback that I will remind you of, I'm sure many of you have read or seen the movie of Holes, sort of a wonderful, really kind of flawless novel that was made into a really good film. And there's a substantial chunk of Holes that is a flashback. But what we are getting in this marvelous structure is there's a plot that's happening in the present day of the main character. And in order for him to resolve his plot, he has to resolve a problem that was set into motion like 2 generations before. And so those flashback scenes are actually essential, right? They are part of bringing to fruition what's going on in the primary timeline of the book, the present day timeline of that narrative. So it would be fun. It would be fun to do a little structural breakdown of Holes. It's got a great structure. It's one of the things that's so fun about that book. So awesome questions today, guys. Let me wrap up. Speaking of time, we have spent a happy hour together talking about writing craft. I love your questions. I love that you attend live. It makes it a great experience for all, and super useful to the people who watch the replay as well. So if you're watching this on the replay and you have questions, pop them in the comments below. I read them all and I will reply to them, and we will keep this discussion going. But in the meantime, I wish you all a very happy week of writing. Love to hear about how the use of time is helping you structure your story and add urgency to your hero's journey of transformation. And I will look forward to hearing what you want to hear about in future live streams. And as always, if you want to get an email from me every week letting you know what's up before it happens, just join my mailing list at www.pathofthestoryteller.com. You can join the Facebook group at Path of the Storyteller, or you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this way you can get alerts and get reminded so you don't miss a future live stream. Thank you all so much for your participation and for coming. I'll look forward to next time.